So we've already talked about all of the kingdoms sort of in general with some brief descriptions. Then we talked a little bit more specifically about archaea, bacteria. What we're going to do for the next sections are talk about protists in some more detail, talk about fungi in some more detail, then we'll move to plants and animals. So for the next several days, we'll be talking about protists. We'll be doing a lab and we'll look at some preserved slides of protists. We'll look at some living protists, and then we'll have a quiz probably early next week about them. So a lot of this will probably be review because we've already talked about protists a little bit. How about the domain? What domain? There's only 3 domains to choose from. Which one do you think protists would belong in? Mia?
Bacteria?
No, they're not bacteria because they have a nucleus in their cells. They're not prokaryotes. So there's, what? No, that's a kingdom. Eukarya. They're in domain eukarya because they are eukaryotes. They have a nucleus in their cells. They have more complex cells. Within that, their kingdom is protist, or protista is the Latin name for it. The protist kingdom is sort of a strange one. When scientists were developing the taxonomic systems, the protist kingdom sort of turned into a place where they said, well, I don't quite know, it's not an animal, it's not a plant, it's not a bacteria, let's throw it in the protist kingdom. And so it sort of became this catch-all where actually some of the things are not that closely related, but for our purposes, we'll just talk about some of the general ideas. And protists are aquatic organisms. They are unicellular, single-celled. They're eukaryotic. They have a nucleus. And they're either autotrophs or heterotrophs, depending on which one we're talking about. Basically, you find protists wherever there's water. If you go to a pond near your house or a stream, and take a sample of that water, look at it under the microscope, you probably find some protists living there. There are also some protists that are parasites that live inside of other organisms. We'll talk about one specific protist towards the end of this week or next week. Protist reproduction, they can reproduce asexually through this process we call binary fission. And we defined this the other day. Does anybody remember what it means, binary fission? Yeah?
Two split?
Yeah, to split into 2. The word binary means 2 parts. The word fission means split. And protists can reproduce asexually by basically splitting in 2. Asexual reproduction, as you know, one parent organism is involved, and it basically just makes a copy of itself. The offspring are identical. In this illustration, you see a single amoeba. What happens is the nucleus, which is where the genetic material is, copies itself. Then you have one amoeba with 2 nucleus, and then the rest of the cell divides so that there's a nucleus in each cell, and you end up eventually with 2 amoeba. They each have a nucleus, they have the exact same DNA. So we are going to talk about individual protists in more detail, okay? Because there's 4 large groups of protists, and their movement is how we put them into these groups. There are ameboids, ciliates, flagellates, and sporozoans. Those are the 4 groups of protists. The ameboids, these are protists that move using these things called pseudopods. You know what pseudo means?
Like semi?
Sort of, kind of, well, or sort of like fake almost. Okay. And pod, that's that root P-O-D. What kind of a doctor do you go to if you're having problems with your feet? No? A podiatrist. You ever heard of that? P-O-D. Pod means feet. So pseudopod means false feet. And what a pseudopod is, see how on this amoeba, these like extensions, these little arm sort of things are moving out? Those are pseudopods. They kind of ooze forward and the amoeba kind of blobs along. So an amoeba is an example of one of these amoeboids. This one is a cilia. Cilia are these tiny little hairs that paddle the protist around. The example we're going to see is the paramecium. Flagellates move using this sort of tail called a flagellum. The one we're going to look at is called the euglena. And then the last type are called the sporozoans. These are protists that don't really move around. They are parasites of other organisms. The one we're going to talk about is called Plasmodium. Is that familiar to anybody? It is a protist that actually causes a disease that affects millions of people throughout the world. I know it's probably a disease you've heard of, because I think you studied it in a unit you did in elementary school. No? It is a disease of the tropics, usually, of warmer climates. It is a disease spread by mosquito. You did a unit on it, right? About DDT, controlling mosquitoes. No? Malaria? Yeah, you knew that, right? So malaria is a disease that is spread by this protist called Plasmodium. So those are our 4 groups. Like I said, we'll look at 3 out of the 4. We'll talk about all of them. Malaria is a blood disease, so your blood cells being infected by this protist. All right, we'll talk about them one at a time, starting with the ameboids. So the ameboids move using those pseudopods, and what they do is they kind of ooze forward. They like send these extensions of their cytoplasm out and then kind of just lob around. That's how they get from place to place. They just ooze forward. So when you look at these pictures of amoeba, you could see these long extensions. Those are the pseudopods.
Is that a real picture?
Yeah, that's a real picture.
That's a real picture.
And here is one you can actually see the amoeba moving. And they kind of move pretty slowly. Their cytoplasm just sort of streams forward. And they have no definite shape. Their shape is flexible. The cell membrane is flexible.
Use it.
Just nice and relaxing.
Is it an amoeba?
It's gonna be music. See how it's sort of moving upward in that?
How do you take a video?
You could just use like a camera or a phone. So the important parts of the amoeba, when you look at this amoeba, the pseudopods are those extensions of their cytoplasm that they ooze forward. They also use them to ingest their food. What happens is the amoeba moves up to a particle of food, it sends its pseudopods around it, and then they connect on the other side. And then if we look at, if I draw this sort of, if you look at this amoeba here, if we have like a little chunk of food, the amoeba moves up to it, sends its pseudopods around it, keeps extending them. Okay. Eventually they connect on the other side. And then where is the food?
Inside.
Now it's inside of the amoeba, right? Because now this is the shape of the amoeba. And it's actually inside of the amoeba in this little bubble. That little bubble we call a food vacuole. So the pseudopods are used for it to move and also to ingest food. And then that food, once it's engulfed, it's in that little bubble, that food vacuole. And then that's where it gets digested as well. The amoeba will send enzymes, produce enzymes into that food vacuole to start to break down that food so the amoeba can use the energy from it. Now, many of these protists live in fresh water. If you would think back to osmosis, what is a problem with a single-celled organism living in fresh water, pure 100% water? Luke?
It could like absorb a lot of water in bursts.
Yeah, think about the eggs we put in fresh water, the gummy bears you put in fresh water, the pictures of blood cells we looked at that were in fresh water. Because of osmosis, water is always diffusing into the cell. And so it could swell up, it could burst. So many protists have a special organelle inside of them that helps sort of solve this problem. It's called the contractile vacuole. Its job is to sort of pump out any excess water that's coming in. You may not know, but probably many of you in your house, you have a sump pump in the basement. What it does is when water is coming into your basement, the sump pump turns on, pumps that water out so your basement doesn't flood. You could think of the contractile vacuole as kind of like the same thing. As water comes into the protist due to osmosis, the contractile vacuole pumps out that excess water so it doesn't harm the protist. All right, ciliates. The ciliates are another group of protists. These are the ones that move using cilia. So they're called cilia. And cilia are these small little hairs that kind of around the outside of the organism. In this drawing, you can see them obviously pretty clearly. A little bit hard to see them in this microscope image, but you can see them in this electron microscope. Kind of looks like this hairy thing. All those little hairs, those are the cilia. And those hairs kind of move together and they sort of paddle it around. They're like tiny little oars paddling this paramecium around. The paramecium always has this distinctive shape. So the amoeba, its shape is always changing. But the paramecium always has this, it looks like sort of a footprint. Sometimes it's called slipper shaped. And it has that shape because it has this kind of shell around the outside. That shell is called a pellicle. It's almost as like a cell wall that gives the paramecium its shape. And because it has this shell around it, this pellicle, it can't engulf its food like the amoeba did. Instead, it has a special organelle, sort of special structure called the oral groove. That is sort of like the mouth of the paramecium. It's this indentation here, or here you can see it up there, down here. And this oral groove, it has little cilia in it that sort of wave in little particles of food. They go down the oral groove into a little tube called the gullet, and that leads to a food bag. So the paramecium sort of has to eat little chunks of food. Finally, to remove waste that has stuff that's been digested, that's no longer needed, because it has this pellicle, it needs a way to get waste out. It doesn't just diffuse out. And that's through this part called the anal pore, which basically is connected to that pellicle. Waste goes into it, and then it empties out into the outside. And our final protist is a flagellate, moves using a flagellum. The one we look at is called the euglena. What do you notice about the euglena? It's green. So what do you think that means about it? It has chloroplast in it, which means what?
It's a type of plant?
It's actually not a plant, it's a protist.
It goes through the cycle of photosynthesis.
Yeah, it can undergo photosynthesis. It is one of the protists that's autotrophic. Right? It can make its own food if light is available. But if there's not light available, it can also consume other organisms, other food particles. So it can be an autotroph or it can be a heterotroph. Depends on the situation. So when you look at the euglena, you could see this flagellum, this sort of whip-like tail. Here in the electron microscope image, you could see it here. Or here in the compound microscope image. And that flagellum helps move it around. Kind of waves back and forth and allows it to swim through the water. In this drawing, you could see these green ovals are on the outside. Those are the chloroplasts, which allows it to make its own food. And it also has this part up here called the eye spot. And the eye spot is a part of the cell that is sensitive to light. Now it can't really see. It's not an eye. It doesn't see anything. But it can tell where there's light so that the euglena can swim towards the light, allowing it to find light so it can undergo photosynthesis. All right. Any questions about the protist? We're going to talk about the different parts and label them tomorrow. And then your homework tomorrow is going to be to make your own drawings of these protists.
Yay.